If you were to take a flight into Milan in northern Italy and then rent a car, you could drive the 55 or so kilometers on the E64 to Bergamo, and then from there continue up the Strada Statale 42 another 50 or so kilometers. At that point, you would find yourself driving alongside the Oglio River, a tributary of the Great Po, just outside of Costa Volpino, above the Lago di Isso, as it descends out of a low mountain valley surrounded by the foothills of the Great Alps that divide Italy from Switzerland and Austria to the north. A few more kilometers up the valley, and you would find yourself in Malegno or Cividate Comuno, which sit across the river from each other. Up the SS-42, just another kilometer, not far from the Sartorio di Minerva, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site known as Val Camonica, and it marks the entrance to a remarkable record of human artistic and cultural activity. In the hills, just on the south and east side of the valley, one will encounter the largest collection of prehistoric petroglyphs found anywhere in the world. Carved over a period beginning 8 millennia before the Romans began keeping records of the area, and continuing up until the 19th century, the carvings show a continuing tradition of human activity. In places, and presumably at times, the figures that are carved overlap each other randomly, while in other locations there seems to be a clear order to their composition and placement, indicating that the carver had a narrative or tableau in mind while he or she was making his or her images in the very stone the mountains are made of. While the carvings have long been known of and have been studied by various scientific personages from time to time, the first systematic examination of the figures was made in the 1960s by the Italian archaeologist Emanuele Nati, who developed a classification system still used today that attempted to group the petroglyphs both by content and possible inscription period, beginning in the late Paleolithic times, when glaciers that would have covered the region during the last ice age would have retreated, and continuing into the Iron Age. Among the most important of these petroglyphs is something known as the Babylonian map. The site of the map is up at the northern end of the valley, just above the village of Capo di Ponte. There, the strata turns up into the foothills to overlook the ancient village, and just off the road there is a carving in the Permian sandstone that may be the oldest topographical map on Earth. Carved into the rock is a depiction of what an ancient community at the site of Capo di Ponte might have looked like sometime before 1000 BCE. If the people who occupied the region were the same ones mentioned by the first century Roman writers, they were known as the ancient communi, and they were likely a pastoral people, shepherds and farmers who made a life in the valley where the Oglio first emerges from the Alps on its way to the Po in the flatlands between Mantua and Cremona. Unlike the smaller but still extensive contemporary carvings at Montebello on the French side of the Alps, which were likely associated with sacred or religious practices of the people there, it is not clear what the purpose of many of the Val Camonica carvings is. While they might have some religious significance, what seems to be more the case is that they are ancient graffiti of bored shepherds who set their flocks to graze on the slopes of the hillsides away from the cultivated fields found in the much richer alluvial soil of the river valley. The Babylonian map, however, seems more deliberate than that. It really does seem to be a record of who owned what, where the roads and boundaries were, how many fields existed, and maybe how many goats, sheep, or other livestock might have belonged to each plot holder. It is a record of the world the people lived in as seen from the hillside that sat above the village. Maybe it was put there by a village elder, tired of petty disputes of who had rights to what land. Maybe it was drawn for those times when the river flooded and jumbled things up. Maybe it was simply the product of one person's desire to chronicle and order his world. What is clear, though, is that the map represents a new step in the nature of the petroglyphs. One sees all of the many things that we've discussed as being so important when thinking about maps. It's clear that the rock carving is a representation of the village, that it strives to show connections as well as separations, and that it uses culturally relevant abstract symbols, ones we don't have a good understanding of necessarily, by the way, to communicate those connections and relationships. For whoever scratched that map into the surface of that glacier-smooth sandstone, they were recording the most important place in their world. Really, the most important place in the world as they knew it. When we look at the early maps that we know of, what one is often struck by is how often that kind of a theme emerges, that of the centrality of the mapmaker's place in the world. It's a bias that's implicit in a lot of map making, I think, and it's one that's still with us sometimes today.
Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery.
Series 5, Finding Our Way. Episode 5, A Centered Universe. And so it is that we finally arrived at talking about historical maps and mapping. After 4 episodes of looking at some of the principles and pitfalls of trying to think about what maps are and how we should interpret them, we're finally in a place to talk about some of the earliest cultural artifacts that we have. But before we dive into that, I want to remind you of a couple of things. First, I think it's really important for us to work to set aside our cultural assumptions about what a map should look like or what a map should do. A great example of this might be if I asked you to imagine some sort of map in your head. I'm guessing that you, just like I do, tend to put north at the top of the map, with east to the right and west to the left. Kind of talked about that in the last episode of why one might do that. What's interesting is that such an orientation is actually a relatively modern custom, only becoming commonplace on maps after the 14th century or so. For much of the period prior to that, the much more common practice was to place east at the top and north to the left, as if one were facing the rising sun by looking at the top of the artifact. During the Islamic Golden Age, especially around the 12th century, Arabic cartographers would often put south at the top of their maps, likely owing to the Nile flowing from south to north in one of the most influential caliphates of the Islamic world, a practice that goes back at least as far as the New Kingdom dynastic period of Egypt. Another assumption we need to be careful about is that maps were primarily local in nature early on. Archaeologists and anthropologists have shown that based on both the artifactual and linguistic evidence, there would have been less of a need for what we might think of as a wayfinding map kind of an approach in early civilizations than we might expect, since the numbers of people needing to travel and the distances traveled were often pretty small. Instead, what one finds are a lot of place maps or plan maps, depictions of locations of importance to someone who is at a specific somewhere. Take the people of Val Camonica, for example. Finding one's way up and down the Oglio River Valley probably wasn't really all that difficult. Sort of a find the river and walk, you know? And if you need to find the river, say you're a little turned around, well, just go up a hillside until you can see it and then walk back downhill in the right direction, and you found it. If you had a small boat, then you could float down the river or paddle up it, assuming the current's not too bad. And that's all you need to really know. There's not a sense of needing to have some sort of a wayfinding tool in that environment. And so what that means is that map up on the hillside probably isn't about wayfinding at all, but rather as a place-orienting exercise. As we'll talk about, in ancient Egypt, even long after the Greeks and Mesopotamians had begun making good maps, what we might think of as wayfinding maps, the pharaoh's many civil servants seem to have rarely mapped or used a map in sort of giving directions. All of that was handled using textual descriptions. Even the results of surveying, the thing that seems to have driven many of the Egyptian advances in mathematics, were not recorded in graphical map form, but just as bunches of text. Maps from the earliest period of the world were instead, most commonly, about placing humanity within the broader framework of the world as they saw it. It's still one of the main functions of maps today, if you think about it. Let me give you an example from my culture here in the United States. When I was growing up in the 1970s, most of my elementary school classrooms had a map of the world somewhere. Sometimes it was up on the wall, sometimes it was hanging on a stand, whatever. Now, what's interesting about the map was that always the United States was placed right at the top center of that map, with the British Isles across the Atlantic Ocean to the right or east, and the vast expanse of the Pacific to the left, bordered on the left edge with Japan and the Siberian regions of the old Soviet Union. In this view, it was clear that the New World was meant to be the center, with the place of pride going to North America, specifically the United States. Only slightly less important was the splitting of the Soviet Union so that it was on the edges, the periphery of the world, split so that its quote-unquote European part was with those former great powers we all had read about originating from, and its quote-unquote Asian portion found with the other mysterious Far Eastern nations, which, by the way, was confusing nomenclature for a young schoolboy who saw those countries as lying to the west of center. It was a bit of, or a clever bit really, of political propaganda, well in line with millennia of map-making, something that's always placed the producing power at the center of the world, often, as was the case in these maps, surrounded by a vast ocean. I have to admit that I actually don't really know what kinds of maps one finds in classrooms today, but since the end of the Cold War, it seems to me that a much more sensible map is seen quite a bit more often. It's one that places the international date line that runs through the middle of the Pacific to the far left side of the map. This places the Atlantic, or actually sort of more accurately, the prime meridian of Greenwich, England, in the middle, dividing the New World on the left side of the map from the Old World and Asia on the right side. While such a view has its own limitations, in this representation of a round globe projected onto a flat plane, something that we'll talk a lot about down the road, countries are not shown as divided, and the Far East really is to the far right-hand side of the map. Just as importantly, it represents a subtle but important reframing of the narrative that emphasizes a more global perspective, where no one country can said to be at the center, well, except maybe England. This, of course, can also be seen as a bit of propaganda, perhaps, but it is the first major break, in a sense, with the practice that's been with humanity since maps were first drawn. So when was that? When were the first things that we'd really see as maps created? As we've discussed, that's kind of hard to say, given the fact that the artifact that contains the map has to have survived to get to us, and it has to have been dated accurately through some means. So the earliest maps we have probably come from Mesopotamia, and they're a lot like the Babylonian map in the sense that they represent local places. A number of fragments of Mesopotamian stone tablets have been found that have parts of what look like a city or an individual building plan or maybe fields. Some of these date to circa 2300 BCE and clearly show that they were, map-like representations of smaller scale features. What we don't have is a sense of what the purpose of the maps might have been, though one, known as the York Tepe map, seems to show several plots of land divided by either streams or canals. What's interesting about this map is that it's the earliest example of a map that indicated directions on it, and this map does have east at the top with north being to the left side, something that's going to be common practice, especially out of those cultures influenced by Mesopotamia for quite some time. One candidate for the oldest map that represents the entire world from the Mesopotamian culture is what is known as the Babylonian World Map. Inscribed on a stone tablet, the map is held in the British Museum and is dated from between the 8th and 6th century BCE. We'll post a picture of the stone map on our website, thescientificodyssey.typepad.com, but a quick description is in order here as it is relevant to our discussion regarding map makers placing themselves at the center of the world. So I need you to get your imagination out here and sort of in your head, sort of think that you're looking at a stone tablet. Maybe it's a little bit bigger than a 3x5 card. So in the case of our stone tablet here, what I need you to do is imagine a circular ring inscribed on that stone tablet. Think of two circles, one a little smaller than the other to create a ring. On the outside of the ring are several triangles pointing outwards from the ring, a bit like rays of the sun if you might think of it that way. Inside the ring is a horizontal rectangular marking about 2/3 of the way up inside of that ring, inside of that inner circle. That rectangle is cut in half by a second rectangle that's about perpendicular, that runs from top to bottom of the ring, well, at least from the top of the ring to about 3/4 of the way towards the bottom of the ring in a vertical sense. There, it runs into another horizontal rectangle. Around the edge of the inside circle are also a series of smaller circles of varying size. One last feature of this map is a curved groove that runs from about the middle of the vertical line, top to bottom rectangle thing, to the right of the bottom rectangle out to the circular ring. So, by the way, if this seems a little bit confusing, you probably want to go out and look at that picture that we'll have on the website. But the big thing I want you to sort of have in your mind is this ring. Inside the ring towards the top is a rectangle. Kind of bisecting that is a second line or rectangle down to a third rectangle. It's about 2/3 of the way down. Now, if all we had was this stone tablet, this map, we might be able to make some educated guesses about what each of the things are based on later maps that we've seen out of that same culture. One such educated guess might be that the ring represents an ocean that surrounds a large area of land. This is found in many later maps from both that region of the world and just generally across the Mediterranean Basin to the west. Knowing the geography, the vertical rectangle would correspond well with the Euphrates River. Note, these wouldn't necessarily be educated guesses, but they might not be bad ones if we're sort of thinking about the map. This is something historians of cartography have to do from time to time with these ancient maps to try to get a handle on what's going on with them. What's fortunate in this case, though, is that along with the map we do have some text, written in cuneiform, of course, that we know how to read. This linguistic description provides a sort of a key or legend to some of the features inscribed on the tablet. For example, the ring is called the Bitter Sea, confirming our assumption of a surrounding ocean, as salt water was often called bitter by the cultures in the region. The upper vertical rectangle is labeled as Babylon. And while the vertical rectangle is not labeled, it seems that it can only be the Euphrates, given its location on the map and the fact that it terminates at the bottom horizontal rectangle, which is labeled as a swamp in the legend. Several of the smaller circles are named as cities in the region. There are two things I think that we can take from this map. First, it is clearly a representation of the Babylonian view of the world, and it's important to note that they, or at least the life-giving river they live on, is the center of that world. Second, the world is flat and probably disc shape, something that was a common view up through this time. While the map is dated to a certain period, as is often the case with artifacts from this region of the world, the indications are that the map is a copy of one found in older documents. One of the big mysteries about the map is the meaning of those outwardly pointing triangles. According to some sources I found, these may represent other lands or islands that the Babylonians might have been aware of, an interpretation that would suggest that the map maker threw them or thought them to be on the periphery of the central role Babylon played in the world. Another interpretation, one perhaps supported by the text, is that these represent supernatural places, such as realms of the gods, or places of myths and legends. If this is true, then the map maker, in his picture, might be saying that the region near the Tigris and Euphrates is the physical world, but that such a world is only part of a fuller metaphysical reality, a theme we've discussed in our previous episodes. Unfortunately, the key is of little help, only labeling these a Nabu in Babylonian, or, translated, that means just regions, and indicating that there would have been either 7 or 8 of them. Another ancient civilization one might expect to find maps in would be that of the cultures that developed around the Nile River, and which would come together, likely through a process of conquest, as Egypt in or around 3100 BCE. What's fascinating about this culture is that we actually don't have many maps that are used in what might be thought of as an everyday context. What we do have is a lot of what might be thought of as cosmological maps found in tombs and on the interiors of the lids of sarcophagi. We talked a good bit about Egyptian astronomy in an early episode of our Finding Our Place series, and so I won't take too much time rehashing that material here. But what seems to be the case is that the spirit of the dead would be provided a map of the heavens that would allow them to navigate to what would have been the circumpolar region of the northern sky, where the stars never dipped below the horizon. The interesting thing about this is that much of the information was actually provided in what are known as decans tables, where the information was represented in a textually organized way by having a certain number of bright stars, usually 3, that marked out what region of the sky would be rising just before the sun. While there are some diagrams or maps of the night sky, these are usually very general, often giving more of a sense of the general cosmological origin stories, or what we might think of as a grand worldview of how the universe was put together. Again, building on that theme we've mentioned a few times now in the episode, the Kingdom of Egypt is always represented in these pictures as being at the center of the cosmology. Missing are other kingdoms or people that the Egyptians knew existed, geographic features beyond the Nile, or even a clear indication of the sense of what the shape of the world might have been. All things that were present in the Babylonian World Map. What should be understood is that these maps were intended to serve one purpose, and that was a metaphysical one, guiding the essence of the now dead person from the mortal coil to whatever was thought to lie in the realm beyond this physical world. In this function, we can see that these funerary artifacts, if we can call them that, are very similar to the stories found in a number of other cultures, though notably those in China near the Yellow River, as well as the Maya and the Inca in Meso and South America, in which you find a rich collection of traditions to help guide the souls of the departed to their eternal resting places. In the New World cultures, it may be that there were a number of map artifacts that could have existed as part of the culture that just didn't survive conquest. Stone carvings on the tomb at the Maya temple site of Palenque seem to serve such a function, though the rich imagery carved into the stone cover of the coffin seems to be more for those left behind than for the departed king. The most ancient mapping artifact related to what might be thought of as everyday, non-metaphysical concerns we have from Egypt are a series of pottery etchings that date to the pre-dynastic period. While these are rudimentary, they clearly show what the artisan intended to represent, and those are things like topographical features such as mountains and rivers, and by the way, the river is probably the Nile, along with boats and water birds. These represent that transition found in many pre-literate cultures from artistic representations to something that is meant to convey geographic meaning to another individual. Following this, during the early dynastic period, one sees the emergence of multiple point-of-view plan maps. These might be for something like a garden or a relatively small geographic region, and in these, one sees the thing being represented in multiple perspectives, one of which is usually a bird's eye view, and then there's something else, maybe a side view or what we might think of today as an elevation view. In these, geographic features are represented abstractly using a common set of symbols. Wavy lines for water, strong geometric lines or triangles for hills or mountains, that kind of thing. A good example of this is found in the temple complex at Thebes, which was built during the New Kingdom period, somewhere around 1500 BCE. Here we find a plan for gardens that depict regularly straight pathway, lined with palm trees, a T-shaped reflection pool that occupies the center of the space, and trellised walls that would be used to hold vines. This theme is carried over to the contemporaneous Book of the Dead, which, among its various spells, one finds a depiction of the perfect plot of land as worked by the souls that have made the journey to the mythical realm of Osiris. In the temples of the 19th and 20th dynasties from this period, one finds relief carvings that indicate a further evolution of a mapping mindset, with more realistic depictions of royal travels and battles, with the relief carvers attempting to depict the events in a series of map-like images in the temple walls. For example, Sethos I is shown traveling along a pathway from outpost to outpost along the way to Canaan, while his successor, Ramesses II, is shown preparing his army for battle with another force across a river, with units laid out with an eye towards realism. The most striking example, however, of Egyptian cartography is what is known as the Turan map of the gold mines. This map is interesting on a whole bunch of levels, from what it does and represents, likely being the oldest map to accurately represent not only geographical but geologic information, but it's also interesting in how it was discovered and handled. So let's dive in and see what we can actually learn from this. To start off with, let's talk a little bit about how the map got found. It's drawn on papyrus, that paper-like substance derived from a reed-like plant. And the map is said to have been collected by Bernardino Drevetti, who is also known as Napoleon's proconsul in Egypt, in that period before 1824. As cartographer A.F. Shore puts it, quote, "The circumstances of the find are not known, but the carelessness of Drevetti's agents resulted in fragmentation of the original papyrus and loss of some parts." End quote. It was discovered in a private tomb in the ancient village of Deir al-Medina, near the modern-day city of Luxor, which ancient name was Thebes. Drevetti kept the map as part of a larger collection of Egyptian documents gathered while he was there as part of that failed French military expedition, and so when he returned, it was sort of turned over to the king of Piedmont and Sardinia, and following a series of events, it now resides in the Museo Egizio in Turin, Italy. The map originated during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses IV, and it's part of a report given to him by the well-known scribe of the tomb, Amenemhotep, son of Ipi, thus dating it to around 1150 BCE. It was prepared, we think, for an expedition to quarry blocks of Beckenstone, which is a regionally specific variety of sandstone from the Wadi Hamadat region in the eastern desert of Egypt. And it's a place from which, stone was gathered for statuary to be carved later. Now, the region of the map represented wouldn't actually be figured out until about 1852, when the British Egyptologist Samuel Birch identified that the top of the map was actually associated with upstream with respect to the Nile, and thus pointed south. From there, he was able to match it to the appropriate region of the Pharaoh's kingdom. According to James A. Harrell, professor of geology at the University of Toledo, quote, "This map shows a 15-kilometer stretch of Wadi Hamadat, Valley of the Many Baths, in the central part of Egypt's eastern desert. The top is oriented to the south, and the source of the Nile River with the west on the right side and the east to the left. There is no constant scale used on the map, but by comparison with the actual distances in Wadi Hamadat, it is evident that the scale varies between 50 and 100 meters for each 1 centimeter on the map." End quote. A.F. Shore's description of the map goes as follows, quote, "The more important section is a fragment measuring approximately 40 centimeters high, generally called the Map of the Gold Mines. It depicts two broad roads running parallel to each other through pinkish-red mountainous regions. They are drawn horizontally across the papyrus, the lower with indications of a rocky bed or sparse vegetation, characteristics of the larger dried-up watercourses or wadis that form the natural routes across the eastern desert from the Nile to the Red Sea. Legends written in Hieratic, the cursive everyday hand of the time, explain where these routes to the left are leading. A broad winding crossway wadi connects the two routes, from which an alternative route is indicated and labeled, also leading to the left. Running vertically from the upper route is yet another road with hieratic text that gives its designation. The significance of the area painted red is explained by another legend that reads, quote, 'The mountains where the gold is worked. They are colored in red.'" End quote. Shore continues. There are other distinctive features outlined, colored, and labeled in Heretic. Near the junction of the cross valley with the upper route is a circular, dark-colored object or image, and it's marked with a second partially overlapping design in darker black line. The figure is probably intended to represent a well, though no text identifies it. A little below and to the right of the design is another, more oblong in shape, colored green with the zigzag lines by which the ancient Egyptians conventionally represented water. Within the design, there are traces of a Heretic group, apparently to be read as cistern, water place, or the like. In the same central section of the map, a round-topped stela is also indicated in white, with a legend dating it to the region of reign of Thessos I of the 19th Dynasty. The feature is presumably to be identified with one of the rock-cut stelae executed by that king, depicting Amun or another deity, presumed on the mountain face flanking the wadi. There are also two man-made features on the upper side of the upper route. One is clearly a large building containing several courts or rooms with connecting doors, described as the resting place or abode of Amun of the pure mountain. There are also three small rectangular forms labeled the houses of the gold-working settlement. Finally, regarding what the map represents, Shore concludes, the texts indicate that the area depicted must be along the natural route from Koptos or Kift on the Nile through the eastern desert via Wadi Hamadat to the port of Qasir on the Red Sea. This route was used in ancient times in the course of expeditions to the Red Sea for trading voyages south to the land known to the Egyptians as Punt. In the central area between the Bir al-Hamat and Bir Fakwar was visited as a source of ornamental stone and gold, and it is rich in rock tablets recording quarrying expeditions and in archaeological evidence of ancient gold mining. End quote. So what we seem to have is an administrative or bureaucratic report or request with the accompanying figures from the scribe Amenhotep to the court of Ramesses IV. It might be a proposal of where to go in order to get the stone for the future carvings that may have been already commissioned, or it might be a summary report of the expedition that explains how the stones were acquired. Given the highly regimented and bureaucratic nature of Egyptian society, especially by this time, we'd expect to see a number of these sort of documents. What's interesting is that we don't find a lot of them. So why the dearth of these kinds of records? Well, I think there are probably two main possibilities. The first is hinted at in the Turan map itself. The map is actually in pretty poor condition, as was alluded to in an earlier quote. The map's in multiple pieces, with the biggest being that portion that mentions the gold mines. The reason for this is that when the map was found, it was actually folded in what some origami experts considered to be the actual earliest known example of folding. After the initial examination, however, the map was then rolled up and just mishandled, separating the map at the folds and abrading off the outermost sections of that scrolled up document. This gives one a sense of the fragility of these kinds of materials, things like cloths and hides, and in this case papyrus. As such, it's not inconceivable that anything not etched or carved into something a lot more permanent would have been pretty unlikely to survive the ravages of time. If this is true, such documents and maps may have been relatively commonplace, at least during the period of the New Kingdom's 19th and 20th dynasties. They just haven't survived. Alternatively, the culture may well have thought that such documentation was fairly ephemeral and unimportant beyond its just immediate use, and so rather than save the documents once their purpose was served, they were discarded. And if one considers the amount of paperwork, or perhaps the better term would have been papyrus work, the state apparatus, would have produced an enormous amount of this, and so that the idea of archiving all the documents might have been thought to be ludicrous. The second possibility is that such documents were actually only rarely produced. Shore, in his essay for the history of cartography, notes that much later in the history of Egypt, up until the time of the Ptolemaic rulers, there seems to be very little in the way of map-making and the like. While there is some evidence of the sorts of site planning types of maps continuing to be made, there isn't a lot of the activity that one might expect. One example of this can be found when thinking about surveying. For a very long time in the practice of surveying, in what we might think of as the English common law tradition, descriptions of land plots have been given both in textual and mapping format, with both having legal standing in disputes. In Egyptian culture, however, this doesn't seem to have been the case. Herodotus tells us that the late dynastic period rulers continued the practice of having detailed survey records for a variety of reasons, but what's missing from these records are the maps that might accompany them. While the textual descriptions of the surveys have been found, there just aren't maps that go with them. This leads one to believe that they weren't created in the first place. So why not? We can tell that from the Turan map, Egyptians had the ability to create reasonably decent maps, at least of things like roads and geographic features. So why not actually use that technology to further illustrate surveys? Shore is of the opinion that it has to do with a culture that has become a bit stuck in its ways, so to speak. Just as Egyptian culture stuck with hieroglyphs long after it became aware of better and more efficient letter-based writing systems through contact with the Phoenicians, and hung on to their 365-day calendar even when they became aware that the solar year was about a quarter day longer than that, so too did they reject mapping in favor of textually based ways of recording information. And while I sort of agree with Shore's hypothesis on this, I think that perhaps the explanation doesn't quite go far enough. When you look at surveying from later times, something we'll talk about in detail down the road, one of the things you get is an impressive amount of both accuracy and precision that more or less continuously improves as long as the culture is stable. So you don't have things like, the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the challenges that represents. That required not only a certain level of mathematics, but also the ability to produce maps to scale. And while the Egyptian cultures had significant mathematical ability, it may not have been quite good enough to produce reliable scale maps, especially if they lacked the trigonometry that would have been available to the Mesopotamian and later Greek cultures. As such, while mapping might have been okay for producing a rough sketch of a region for a report, that sketch would not have been to scale as noted by Harrell. And so it wouldn't have been nearly good enough for the very serious business of plotting out a tenant's land and then assessing taxes on that. A government might be willing to be sort of loosey-goosey with reports, but it wasn't going to mess around when it came to extracting its pound of flesh, or, in this case, its bushels of grain. Therefore, if a map couldn't give the precision it needed to do that sort of taxation and surveying well, then there really wasn't any point in using the technology. And this brings us back to that stone above the river valley in northern Italy. That map probably wasn't meant to be what we might think of as a legal document today. Sure, it might have been used to reset things after a big flood or other catastrophe, but that's not really what it was about. And that's not what a lot of the Babylonian or Egyptian mapping was about. It was about telling a story about a people's place in the world. Like so many of the carvings along the hillsides of Val Camonica, the map above Capo di Ponte is a statement that these are a people beside the river, clustered in a community, making a life together. And that, I think, is what the map was really fundamentally about to begin with. It will become so much more, of course, as a tool, as a technology, as a way of seeing space and finding our way through it. But to begin with, maps were about us as human beings finding our place in a huge wide world that we were trying to make sense of. And it is in this way, I think, that maps are really an outgrowth of that same curiosity and drive to know. That same sort of thing that will, over the course of a couple of millennia, give rise to science. As we wrap this episode up, let me reiterate a couple of things. First, I've made a mention of a lot of different maps. We'll post pictures of these out on our website, thescientificodyssey.typepad.com, so those of you who are curious can go out and have a look at them. I'll also post links to a couple of interesting scholarly articles I've come across that discuss the maps, especially the Turan gold map. Second, I want to express again that when we're looking at the maps, remember that the cultural conventions of the map makers may have been very different than the ones we take for granted today. In the modern West, we often have a desire for very literal and concrete interpretations of past artifacts. Sometimes that serves us well, but other times we must be willing to look at things more metaphorically. Finally, as is always the case when trying to understand ancient cultures from the artifacts they leave behind, we have to be very careful in assigning meaning. If I recall correctly, there's a story floating around out in the internet somewhere that sort of imagines a culture some several centuries in the future that comes across a Las Vegas honeymoon suite after it's been buried in the detritus of some sort of apocalyptic event. The author of the story has the future archaeologists and anthropologists assign all sorts of strange meanings and symbolism to the things like the television and the toilet and the heart-shaped bed that's ubiquitous in these sorts of rooms. And all of these assignments are really quite hilarious to those of us who understand those things from within the norms of our present culture. Of course, that's setting aside the absurdities that might be inherent in them today. What those triangles on the Babylonian World Map mean is pretty hard to fathom. I've read explanations, as I've mentioned, that range from them being physical islands to mystical realms to areas of the gods. Unless we either come across another copy of the map that is more complete both in the engraving and in the text, or some other cross-corroborating evidence, we should have the humility to say that we just don't know what they are, and that we're okay with that. As we get towards the end here, I also want to make sure I say a couple of other things. First off, again, thanks to the folks at the Blue Dot Sessions for providing the music that is the backdrop of all these shows that we do. On a more serious and tragic note, I'd also like to take a moment to dedicate this episode of the podcast to my friend and colleague, Dr. Mark King. Dr. King taught English and writing composition at the same college I have for the past 17 years, and he was as stalwart a fellow traveler as I have known in my career. We commiserated over our students' shortcomings, celebrated their victories and successes, fought what we saw as misguided administrative initiatives, supported those that we saw as being well-intentioned, attended countless committee meetings together and graduations as well, and did all of those other things that college faculty do all over the world. So it brings me great sadness to say that Mark has died this past week, leaving behind his wife Laura and daughter Katie, along with a number of us who counted him among our closest friends. Mark was a Chicago native and a lover of baseball, and so was overjoyed when his beloved Cubs finally broke their curse a few years back. He and I shared an enjoyment of minor league baseball and the game which we felt, both of us I think, felt captured the pastime in its purest and most joyful form. Over the last few years, we had taken to getting together to sample new whiskeys while talking about the world we saw around us, and I can't tell you how much I'll miss being able to do that with my friend. It was a much-needed balm in a chaotic world full of absurdity. He was also a friend of the podcast, encouraging me and offering helpful suggestions as I pitched various ideas about where I saw the Odyssey sailing. So as we close this episode, I hope you'll join me, either now or at a quieter time this evening, in raising a glass to Mark King. May his memory be eternal. In our next episode, we'll take a look at cartography and geography in the classical world of antiquity. Until next time, full sails on your journey.